The US will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. I want to throw up. This is absolutely disgusting. Again, Trump wants to make money. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war. What Ukrainian war crimes are we talking about? The war crimes are Russian. The Ukrainian prosecutor's office has collected 200,000 Russian war crimes committed in the last 3.5 years in Ukraine. 200,000. Do those Europeans leaders have the balls to stand up to Donald Trump? And this is the bigger question. This kind of agreement opens the door to a third Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you speak Ukrainian in Russian occupied Ukraine, you can get arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. So the United States is basically allowing and agreeing to countries using military aggression to expand their territories. This opens the door to China attacking and invading and annexing Taiwan.
Well, this so-called plan looks like a Russian text that's been Google translated and then submitted by Trump to Ukrainians. This is how it comes across, and you'll see from my explanations because of that. Ukrainians have potentially three or two options. Obviously, the it's been condemned by pretty much everybody I can see, and so that one option would be to tell Trump to take a hike. I mean, that's easier for me to do than for the president of Ukraine. At the same time, what does Trump have that he can pressure Ukraine on? The US under Trump does not provide financial support to Ukraine and does not provide military aid to Ukraine. It sells military equipment to Ukraine, which Trump is threatening to end. I suspect that that's just a false threat because US military manufacturers want to sell this stuff to the European Union and to NATO, who then give it to Ukraine. And I doubt whether Trump would go against that. So I think that's a false threat. The other more bigger threat, which obviously I'm not expert to talk about, is the threat to end US intelligence support to Ukraine's military actions. That has been done already once under Trump, then it was revived. Um, can the Europeans kind of counter with their own intelligence? Maybe the French and the British, for example. Um, so the one possibility is Ukraine tells Trump to take a hike. We can't accept this. There's too many red lines. A second option is that Ukraine accepts the plan, and then de facto Ukraine is no longer an independent state. That's not only bad for Ukrainians and an insult to all those Ukrainians who have died in this war, but it's, of course, it's something the Europeans would not want. I mean, the Estonians or the Latvians, Lithuanians, Finns, Swedes, Poles, um, Brits. I mean, this would mean Putin and Russia have gotten away with it and gives them an appetite for further aggression. So, I mean, the population of Estonia is smaller than the population of Kyiv. They're going to be very worried that something like this sets a precedent. So that's the potentially second option, which I don't think is possible. And nobody talks about this in their commentaries in social media. And that is that even if Zelensky signed this and said, okay, I'm agreeing, it has to be ratified by Ukraine's parliament. Ukraine is a parliamentary democracy. And there's simply no way that there would be enough votes in parliament to ratify this. And these things don't take these things take time. And Trump has put a deadline of Thanksgiving, which is this coming Thursday. Um, the third option is, and some commentators have suggested ways to do this, is to negotiate various parts of it which are contentious. That's unclear if that's possible because the way it's been presented as a kind of an ultimatum, without, of course, Ukrainian or European input, is an ultimatum that you have to agree to this by Thanksgiving. Doesn't suggest that the Trump team are interested in any kind of Ukrainian feedback to say, can we tweak this? Can we change this? So that's simply unclear. So I suspect that's what Zelensky will go for, this one in the middle, not to completely say to Trump, take a hike, and of course not to accept it. But whether that's possible, who the hell knows in this chaotic White House? But let's go through some of the most contentious issues. And I'm not going to go through all 28 because not all 28 are really that sort of relevant to Ukraine. But let's go through the ones which are. Number three, in this 28 so-called plan. It says that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. Well, we've heard this before. Russia's been doing military aggression since 1991 when the USSR disintegrated. It's undertaken military aggression under Boris Yeltsin against Moldova, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and under Putin against Syria and Ukraine. I think it's wrong in this plan to equalize um, NATO enlargement, not expansion. You should use enlargement here. NATO enlargement with Russian military aggression. NATO enlargement is peaceful. It's not led to any wars. And the countries that have joined NATO have done it of their own sovereign decisions. So why should these two things be equated? I think that's completely um, wrong. Point five, Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. You have two problems here. Firstly, Ukrainians are distrustful of the West in general because they were betrayed by Britain and by the United States, um, by maybe France and China as well, in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine and the Budapest Memorandum was shown to be a complete worthless piece of paper. So can can Ukrainians trust reliable security guarantees? um, So-called reliable security guarantees. And secondly, can you trust Trump or Putin? I don't think you can trust. I don't think anybody seriously can trust Donald Trump. Firstly, he changes his mind more times than I change my socks, and that's been seen in the last 10 months. And of course, you can't trust Vladimir Putin. So, I mean, what's the kind of security guarantees are we talking about here? Point six, um, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces would be limited to 600,000 personnel. I don't even know why this is here. Since when is it up to the United States or Russia or any country to decide the size of Ukraine's armed forces? That's a decision of a sovereign country, Ukraine. And why in this point is there no mention of the size of the Russian armed forces? I mean, I think you could maybe accept a decision about the size of the Ukrainian armed forces if you also accept a decision about reducing the size of the Russian armed forces. Let's equalize here. Why is this one-sided against Ukraine, which this entire plan seems to be? Point seven. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. There are many problems here. Firstly, that you will never find in the Ukrainian parliament two-thirds of its deputies who will agree to change the constitution, to remove the clause about NATO membership as a goal. It's simply impossible. So how is this going to actually happen? Again, even if Zelensky wanted it to be. A second problem is that NATO would have to, the United States is not NATO. It's an important member of NATO, but it's not NATO. And this is a decision of NATO's 30 odd members to decide. And I'm sure a lot of those NATO members will not agree to this clause about an open door policy for potential members to be removed. And thirdly, and what about the last 16 years from 2008 to 2024, when on at every annual NATO summit,
The resolution stated that Ukraine will become a future member. Are we to assume that that now is going to be a complete pack of lies? That this was all simply not true? That NATO was lying to Ukraine? And if that's what we have to believe, then what does that tell us about so-called security guarantees? If they're going to lie about that and betray Ukraine about NATO membership, why are they not going to lie about security guarantees? So I think that's a very contentious issue. And the idea that you can simply block one country from joining. And you have to try to put this into some kind of perspective. Russia, on its western borders six countries, six NATO members, actually. Why doesn't Russia only have a problem with one of those countries, Ukraine, joining NATO? It doesn't have a problem with Poland, Finland, Estonia, but it does have a problem with Ukraine. And you have to maybe ask that question. So maybe it's not a question of a problem of NATO membership, it's a question of if Ukraine joins the EU and NATO, Ukraine is lost forever to Russian empire, Russian sphere of influence. Point 10. The US will receive compensation for the security guarantee. I just find this absolutely disgusting. Trump he's not a human being. The guy is despicable. He wants to make money on the back of Ukrainian bloodshed. I find this absolutely abhorrent. Um, Related to this is that if Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose the guarantee. Sorry? Ukraine invade Russia? What is this all about? Ukraine's never invaded Russia, and Ukraine has no intention of invading any country, including Russia. Why are Ukraine and Russia put on the same pedestal? It's Russia that's the aggressor here, not Ukraine. If Russia invades Ukraine, there will be decisive coordinated military response. Yeah, we saw that in 2014. The West basically put up two fingers to Ukraine. Nothing happened. They simply ignored what was taking place, and they pretended for the next 8 years it was a civil war in Ukraine, and they blocked even the supply of military aid to Ukraine, which was under attack. Which and finally, they told President Poroshenko to forget about ever getting Crimea back. This is what the West did in the period between 2014 and 2021. And you want Ukrainians to trust them and to trust this? This kind of agreement opens the door to a third Russian invasion of Ukraine. The two Minsk agreements negotiated in the autumn of 2014, spring of 2015, opened the door to the 2002 full-scale invasion. This type of agreement will open the door to a third invasion of Ukraine down the road when Ukraine has been demilitarized, which is always the goal of Putin. If Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. This is again a rather strange demand. What about consequences if Russia launches missiles against Kyiv or another Ukrainian city? Why is it just one-sided about Ukraine attacking these two Russian cities? And what happens if Ukraine hits other Russian cities, like, for example, Volgograd or Nizhny Novgorod, or I don't know, parts of occupied Ukraine under Russian control, or Russian refineries? I mean, this is rather strange point in this so-called plan. Point 11, Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will receive short-term preferential access. I have no understanding why the US and Russia are talking about this. The US and Russia are not members of the European Union. It's got bugger all to do with them. Nothing to do with them. This is an issue for the European Union and Ukraine, not for anybody else. Um, and let's remember how Russia has lied perennially about this. In 2013, Russia applied tremendous pressure on President Yanukovych to not sign the association agreement with the European Union. And he backed away from signing that, which led to the Euromaidan revolution. So the idea that somehow Russia has no problem with EU membership is complete rubbish. And let's just remember that. A pow Point 12 is a powerful global package of measures will be introduced to rebuild Ukraine. The cost of rebuilding Ukraine because of Russian attacks is far larger than the 200 billion outlined in point 14 of this plan. There are estimates of something like 500 plus uh, billion dollars, how much it's going to cost. And one has to ask, why is Russia not being required to foot the entire bill for its destruction of Ukraine? Who's going to pay for this? I mean, if it's not Russia, somebody else has to pay for it. Ukraine can't afford to pay for it after an ending of the war. And why should the West? Why should the Europeans pay for it? This should be the Russians paying for this. Point 14, frozen funds will be used as follows. 100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in US-led efforts. So again, Donald Trump wants to make money off the back of Ukrainian bloodshed and invested in Ukraine. The US will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. I want to throw up. This is absolutely disgusting. That again, Trump wants to make money from this this tragedy of destruction of Ukraine and murder of so many innocent people. Point 16, Russia will enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine. Yeah, and I often see pigs fly as well in front of my window. If anybody seriously believes this, then they have been smoking too many funny cigarettes. Point 18. Ukraine agrees to be a non-nuclear state in accordance with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. What this translates as is Russia is paranoid about the idea that Ukraine is going to get fed up of Western support and again rebuild nuclear weapons or become a nuclear weapon state. This is what Russia's afraid of, and that's how I read this point. Point 19. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant will be relaunched under the supervision of the IAEA, and the electricity produced there will be divided 50-50 between Russia and Ukraine. Why should Russia receive any of this electricity? This is a nuclear power plant, which is the biggest in Europe, by the way, on Ukrainian soil. This has nothing to do with Russia. Russia's occupying it illegally. So I just can't see Ukraine agreeing to that. The entire Because this is so dangerous, the entire nuclear power plant should be put under the supervision of the IAEA, but the electricity should be provided to Ukrainians only, not to half to Russians and half to Ukrainians. Now we get on to some very, very sexy topics that the Russians have always been very angry about. And we're talking about education in schools, they're talking about tolerance of different cultures, eliminating racism and prejudice. Um, Firstly, I want to see how this applies to Russia, both Russian occupied Ukraine and inside Russia itself. Or is it just for Ukraine again, or is it just one-sided? Education, language, cultural, and religious policies in Russian occupied Donbass and Crimea since 2014 and in Russian-occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson since 2022 include the following: the banning of the Ukrainian language, Russification, theft of Ukrainian art and culture stolen and taken to Moscow, destruction of Ukrainian monuments, and banning of and repression of clergy from the Ukrainian Greek Catholic, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and Protestant churches. Is that all going to end now? Is Russia going to be also tolerant towards different cultures and eliminate racism and prejudice, or is it just a demand towards Ukrainians? Ukraine is by far a more tolerant society than Russian occupied Ukraine or inside Russia as well. So let's put that into perspective. Ukraine will adopt, again, just Ukraine will adopt. Why not Ukraine and Russia will adopt? EU rules on religious tolerance and protection of linguistic minorities. And what about Russia here? Well, why is Russia not being demanded to apply rules on religious tolerance and protection of linguistic minorities? Russia bans three Ukrainian churches, Greek Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, in Russian occupied Ukraine. The clergy from there are tortured, repressed, and murdered. So why is there no demand to Russia on this? Why is the demand only to Ukraine, which is has a very highly tolerant society? Both countries will agree to abolish discriminatory measures and guarantee the rights of Ukrainian and Russian media and education. The Russian occupied Ukraine bans the Ukrainian language. It's not allowed to exist. If you speak Ukrainian in Russian occupied Ukraine, you can get arrested, tortured, and imprisoned just for speaking Ukrainian. Or if the police or security forces find something like a Ukrainian website on your mobile phone. Ukrainian media are banned. They've been banned inside Russia for decades. The Ukrainian library in Moscow was shut down 15 years ago, and the lady who was in charge of that library was put in prison. Ukrainian media are banned from Russian occupied Ukraine. The mobile operators and the satellite TV operators prevent Ukrainian broadcasts coming into Russian occupied Ukraine. Russia is introducing special satellite dishes that only take Russian programs. So why is this just a demand to Ukraine and not to both countries? And especially towards Russia, which is actually the guilty party here. C, all Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. I completely agree. I think the Russian people should remove their fascist dictatorship led by Vladimir Putin. The only fascist in place here is Russia. Russia is a fascist country. This is a country that we describe as a fascist dictatorship. Ian Garner and myself, in a new edited book that came out about a month ago, published by Ibidem in Germany and Columbia University Press in New York. Um, of the two countries, Ukraine is a democracy where the far right does not have any influence in Ukrainian politics or in elections, and Russia is a fascist dictatorship. So I completely agree. Let's remove the fascist dictatorship in Moscow. Point 21, territories. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. This will be an incredibly bad step. It destroys the international legal important question of the sanctity of the territorial integrity of states. So the United States is basically allowing and agreeing to countries using military aggression to expand their territories. This opens the door to China attacking and invading and annexing Taiwan. Ukrainian Europe will never agree to this. It's not just Ukraine. I mean, can you imagine for Estonia, this means the Russian-speaking area of Narva could be next on the list, or in Latvia, or in Finland, or somewhere. It opens a Pandora's box of potential future Russian aggression. So this is a non-starter for anybody. Kherson and Zaporizhia will be frozen along the line of contact, which will mean de facto recognition along the line of contact. So Russia doesn't have to make any withdrawals from its territory that's occupied in Ukraine. Only Ukraine has to. Why is there no demand, for example, that there's a simultaneous withdrawal? Ukraine can withdraw from Donetsk, what it controls, and Russia withdraws from Zaporizhia and Kherson. That at least would be kind of some kind of equal approach to both sides. But no, there's only a demand to the Ukrainians again, which makes one very suspicious that this was not all written in Moscow. Point D of this point. Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they control, and this will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone. Russian forces will not enter this zone. Ukraine will never agree to this, not only because Russia has been unable to take the territory for 3 years or nearly 4 years, but also because it opens the door to Russia then invading other parts of Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia in particular, from that western part of Donetsk Oblast, which has been built up as a fortress belt to protect the other oblasts or regions of Ukraine to the east and south. So again, this is a non-starter both for Ukraine and the European Union. It's been raised in the past by Trump, and in the past, Ukraine has said, forget it, this is a red line. Point 25, Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Again, what does this got to do with Russia and the United States? Ukraine's a sovereign country. It's a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. The US, Russia, and no other country has a right to demand when Ukraine should hold elections. This is up to Ukrainian elected bodies like the Ukrainian parliament and the government and the president. And it's up to the Ukrainian people, their voters. It's not up to Russia or which has never had a democratic election for the last 30 years. Probably the last one was in the 90s. And it's certainly not up to Donald Trump, who uh, tried to falsify the 2020 elections in the United States. Um, so I think again this is a non-starter. This is up to the Ukrainians to decide when they hold their elections, not up to anybody else. Point 26. And this is probably one of the most disgusting points in the plan. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any claims in the future. So again, Ukraine and Russia are put on the same pedestal. See, what Ukrainian war crimes are we talking about? The war crimes are Russian. The Ukrainian prosecutor's office has collected 200,000 Russian war crimes committed in the last 3.5 years in Ukraine. 200,000. The International Criminal Court has criminally charged 6 Russians, including Vladimir Putin. The European Union and Council of Europe are planning to hold next year a tribunal on Russian military aggression. So let's get this in perspective. And the idea that Ukrainians who demand justice for what has taken place in Ukraine, the raping of children from the age of 4 up to women in the age of 82, raping of men, the looting, the torture, the executions, the war crimes committed by Russian soldiers, the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Do you, I mean, no Ukrainian leader could say we have to forget about all of this to the Ukrainian people. Ukrainians will never accept this, and so this is a non-starter. Um, and in particular because Russia and the United States are not signatories to the ICC Rome Statute, so they have no saying in this matter. And charges issued by the ICC, these 6 charges, cannot be withdrawn. It's legally impossible. So the idea that somehow this can be changed or manipulated is simply fantasy world. And again, I doubt whether the Council of Europe and the European Union are going to cancel the holding of this tribunal next year on military aggression. I mean, the funds have been laid out. There's Ukraine and the Council of Europe have signed an agreement to this effect, and so it's going to go ahead. So I mean, find it very difficult, probably impossible. I mean, I can't predict, but that Zelensky can agree to this plan. I somehow that also don't believe he has the ability, because I don't think the Europeans would want this, for him to tell Trump to take a hike. So he's going to try to maybe renegotiate some of these contentious points, particularly the ones I've raised. Maybe get a better deal. But once he starts doing that, Russia will not be happy. There's no way that Russia will agree probably to the changes that Ukraine's going to put forward. So we're back to square one again. Um, I mean, I think the Europeans, of course, and by Europeans I mean here the EU, Britain, and Norway, are important here because Ukraine's not alone. Unlike, say, the Palestinians in Gaza, who had a Trump peace plan imposed upon them, which was very unfair to them. Here, the Ukrainians have at least the Europeans behind their backs. But the question is, do those Europeans leaders have the balls to stand up to Donald Trump? And this is the bigger question. In my own country, Prime Minister Starmer certainly has not none of those. He needs to grow a pair. And one wonders whether the others will. Maybe Macron will. A final point is that um, throughout this year, we've seen attempts by European countries to try to woo Donald Trump. You know, Britain invited Trump to England to meet the monarchy, to a state visit, to banquets. The Finnish president played golf with Trump. They all tried to sort of get Trump's ear to woo him. It was all a complete waste of time. Complete waste of time. Because all along, Trump has been in bed with Putin. I mean, there's simply no question. This plan isn't even an attempt to be balanced between both sides. All the demands are on the Ukrainian side. There are no demands towards the Russians. And this is what actually makes it even more disgusting as a proposal. Ronald Reagan must be looking down and wondering what the hell is happening in the Republican Party and what is happening to the United States. Where are those Republicans who should be standing up against Trump? Where are those Democrats? Where are they? Where's their voice? Trump should be called out on this. Um, I wouldn't want to be in President Zelensky's shoes. He has 6 days to work with the Europeans to maybe suggest changes. Um, but but what's going to happen is anybody's guess. If Trump agrees to some of those changes or those changes, I think that we're back to pretty much square one because I think the changes that the Ukrainians will be demanding are not going to be acceptable to Russia. So um, let's see.